Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in to HK Cheating Stories. We appreciate each and every one of you joining us. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's get the story started. My name's Adrian Cole. Most people at that wedding didn't recognize me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. To them, I was just a name on a handwritten invitation, a ghost from Rachel's past, her ex, the dropout who never measured up. But what they didn't know was that I'd built an empire of my own, one that didn't need boardrooms or applause. And when her new husband tried to humiliate me in front of a room full of elites, I smiled, because I knew something he didn't. That night, I didn't just show up. I came to end the story on my terms. I never imagined I'd set foot in a place like this again. The towering glass high-rise shimmered under the city's golden lights, casting reflections that looked more like illusions than architecture. Outside, valets opened doors for guests stepping out of luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, a couple of Lamborghinis just to show off. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos laughed with practiced ease. Women floated past in floor-length designer gowns, diamonds glittering at their necks like stars stolen from the night sky. And then, there was me. I didn't belong here. Not anymore. I stood still for a moment, just outside the grand entrance, my heart pounding with something I couldn't quite name. Was it regret? Curiosity? Or something darker, deeper, like a wound that hadn't fully healed, no matter how far I'd run from it? Rachel's wedding. My ex-wife. It had been years since we last saw each other, years since she'd walked out of our tiny apartment with her eyes full of ambition and her voice void of warmth. I told myself I'd buried it all, her, the past, the pain. But when the invitation arrived, handwritten in that same graceful script I used to watch her practice in the margins of her business textbooks, something shifted. I hope you'll attend. That was all it said. No explanation. No pleasantries. Just 4 words. Deliberate. Loaded. I should have tossed it in the trash. I almost did. But curiosity, that damn thing never leaves you alone. Especially when it whispers, what if? So, I came. The doorman nodded respectfully as I walked through the entrance, though I could feel the eyes, glances like invisible daggers, from guests who couldn't place me, and therefore assumed I wasn't worth knowing. The lobby opened into a massive ballroom, and stepping inside felt like stepping through time. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal. The floor gleamed like a mirror, polished so clean I could see the reflection of my past staring back at me. Everything about the place screamed wealth, control, success, Rachel's world. Not mine. Soft strings from a live orchestra curled through the air like smoke. Waiters moved in perfect synchrony, holding silver trays of champagne flutes and imported hors d'oeuvres I couldn't even pronounce. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a spectacle. A coronation. Rachel had built her empire, and this was her victory parade. I kept to the edges, unseen, unnoticed. I was a ghost in a crowd of kings. Until I saw him. Greg. Her new husband. The replacement. He stood at the center of the room like he owned it, arm wrapped tightly around Rachel's waist. Tall, square-jawed, hair slicked back with the kind of confidence only money or arrogance could buy. I'd seen his face before. You couldn't open a finance magazine without seeing some profile on him. Real estate investments. Hedge funds. Global wealth portfolios. One of those guys who called billionaires by their first names and thought empathy was a liability. And then his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me. Pretend I didn't exist. That would have been smarter. Instead, he smirked. Not a friendly smile. Not even an indifferent one. It was the kind of smirk men like him gave to people they assumed were beneath them. The kind that said, "You've already lost, and I'm just here to enjoy the view." He leaned in toward Rachel, whispered something in her ear, then started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately, like a predator that knew its prey wasn't going to run. When he got close, he didn't offer his hand. Just stood there, tilting his head like he was inspecting a dent in an otherwise flawless car. What is it? The high school dropout, right? He asked with mock politeness, voice low so only I could hear. I didn't flinch. Just stared at him. Quiet. Measured. He smiled wider. Why don't you do yourself a favor and cut ties with my wife? It's a little pathetic, don't you think? The air between us went still. The kind of stillness right before a storm breaks. I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. This man had no idea who he was talking to. I could have answered. Could have humiliated him right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, slow, deliberate, and full of something he couldn't quite place. Because what Greg didn't realize What Rachel had probably forgotten is that I didn't just survive after she left. I thrived. And if he thought I came here to reminisce or chase closure, he was in for a lesson. This wedding? This wasn't her moment. It was mine. Greg didn't say another word after his little jab. He just smirked, turned, and walked back toward Rachel like he'd just stepped on a bug. His stride was confident, deliberate. He was the king of this castle, and in his mind, I was just another poor soul who had wandered in through the service entrance. I watched him go, watched the way his hand clung to her waist like ownership. And Rachel? She didn't even glance in my direction. Not once. Maybe she didn't see me. Or maybe pretending I wasn't there was easier than facing what she left behind. I drifted toward the far wall, where the shadows were thicker, and leaned against a marble column, letting the scene unfold like a movie I wasn't a part of. Around me, the guests buzzed like bees in designer suits, talking mergers, market predictions, country club politics. The scent of money was everywhere, and the perfume, the laughter, the way they held their champagne glasses like trophies. This wasn't my world. Not anymore. But it used to be hers and mine. Or at least I thought it was. There was a time years ago when Rachel and I shared a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a second-hand futon that doubled as our bed. Back then, she'd sit beside me on the old piano bench while I played until my fingers ached. Her head would rest on my shoulder, and her voice would be barely more than a breath when she'd say, "Play that one again. The one that makes my chest ache." She used to tell me my music made her feel alive. And I believed her. But somewhere along the way, that changed. I still remember the first time she said it. We were having dinner, boxed mac and cheese, if I recall, and she looked up from her plate, her voice carefully neutral. "You ever think about getting a real job?" I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That was the beginning of the slow unraveling. The subtle comments. The questions about my plan. The quiet disapproval that grew louder with every missed rent payment and every rejection email for the fellowship I never really wanted in the first place. To Rachel, life was a blueprint. You picked the right school, the right job, the right husband. Everything was a calculated step toward security and success. And me? I was the unpredictable variable. The wild note in her carefully composed symphony. Eventually, she left. No tears, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet evening, a packed suitcase, and a sentence I still hear sometimes when the nights are long. "This isn't working." She didn't look back. She didn't need to. A violin string snapped mid-performance somewhere in the orchestra pit, the sharp twang cutting through the chatter like a gunshot. No one seemed to notice, but I did. Funny how something so small can remind you exactly where you are and where you aren't. I sipped from the glass a waiter had handed me earlier. Whiskey. Aged, expensive. But it tasted like ash in my mouth. I should have left. Should have walked out the moment Greg opened his smug mouth. But I didn't. Something in me wanted to stay. Not out of spite. Not for revenge. But to see it for myself, to see her world, the one she chose over me. A voice broke through my thoughts. "You really came." I turned to find a familiar face. Matt, Rachel's younger brother, stood beside me, holding a glass of something neon blue and entirely out of place in this sea of gold and ivory. He looked older now, but still had that same wry smile, the one that said he was always 2 steps ahead of whatever you were thinking. "Matt," I said, surprised. "Didn't think you'd remember me." Hard to forget the guy who used to play piano till 3 in the morning and made my sister actually smile. I smiled, the first real one all night. "Didn't expect to see you here." He shrugged. "Obligation. Plus, someone had to witness the circus up close." He looked around, then leaned in slightly. "Greg doesn't know who you are, does he?" "No," I replied, voice calm. Matt laughed under his breath. "He's in for a hell of a night." I didn't respond. Just took another sip of the overpriced whiskey. Then, right on cue, Greg's voice rang out from across the ballroom, louder this time, laced with arrogance. "Why is someone like him even here? This is an event for people of status." Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The room held its breath. I looked up and met his gaze. Greg was enjoying himself. He wanted a scene. He wanted to publicly remind everyone that I didn't belong, that I was just a relic from Rachel's past, dragged into the present by mistake. I could have clapped back, could have told him exactly who I was, but I didn't. Instead, I chuckled. Quiet, amused. That made him pause. "What's funny?" he asked, his voice sharper now. I met his eyes, voice smooth. "I just find it interesting how people think status is defined by the suits they wear, or the numbers on a business card." Greg scoffed. "That's exactly what status is." "And you?" You're just some nobody my wife invited out of pity. My smile didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Because the truth? I didn't need to prove anything to him. He had no idea who I was. But he would. Soon. Greg stood there, basking in his own ignorance, thinking he'd put me in my place with a few sharp words and a condescending smirk. But the truth? He hadn't even scratched the surface. The man thought status was about dollar signs and designer shoes. Yet he had no idea that the one he was mocking could buy and sell his entire empire before dessert was served. I didn't say a word, just held that amused smile a second longer, let it linger in the air like the final note of a song only I could hear. He was starting to squirm. The silence was doing its job. Matt leaned closer, still grinning. He really doesn't know who you are, does he? No, I said. But he will. Matt let out a quiet laugh, then turned back toward the crowd like he was watching a live performance. Which, in a way, he was. As the conversations picked up again, I sank back into the shadows, letting my mind drift. Not to Greg, not to the glittering crowd or the orchestra, but to her. Rachel. We weren't always this, two strangers orbiting different planets. There was a time when she was my whole universe. And I was hers. We met when we were 17. She was already chasing perfection, valedictorian, class president, early acceptance to a business program on the East Coast. I was the guy who barely showed up to class because I was too busy sneaking into the music room to compose pieces no one else cared about. But somehow, we found each other. She used to say my music was the one thing in her life that made sense without needing explanation. I'd sit at the keys, and she'd close her eyes and listen like she was hearing the language of her soul translated in real time. She called my hands magic, said they moved like they knew what her heart wanted before she did. For a while, that was enough. We moved into a shoebox apartment after college, paint-chipped walls, a broken radiator in winter, and a view of nothing. But we were in love. She'd study late into the night, eyes buried in market forecasts and investment strategy books. I'd sit at the old, upright piano in the corner, playing until my fingers were numb. Our lives were loud and chaotic and beautiful in that way only young, struggling love can be. Then the shift came, small at first, like a draft sneaking in under the door. You should think about something more stable, she said one night, flipping through a job listing for entry-level financial analysts. I nodded but said nothing. I knew what she meant. You can't live off gigs forever, she added softly. At some point, don't you want more? More. What a word. To her, it meant a mortgage, a promotion, a LinkedIn profile that made people jealous. To me, it meant playing for a crowd that felt something. Anything. But I didn't fight her. Not then. I thought maybe she'd come around. She didn't. The comments became routine. The silences heavier. Love turned into logic. Passion into pressure. One night, I caught her reading an article titled, "Why Artists Make Terrible Partners." She didn't notice me standing behind her. I never mentioned it. Because deep down, I already knew. The night she left, she didn't yell. Didn't cry. Just stood by the door with her suitcase and said, "This isn't working." I asked if there was someone else. "There isn't," she said. "But there will be. Eventually. Because we're going in different directions." And that was it. She walked out. And I let her go. I didn't chase. Didn't beg. Because the truth was, she was right. We were no longer in sync. I had stopped being a partner in her eyes and started being an anchor. She rose, climbed, built her empire, brick by polished brick. And me? I disappeared into my music. I played anywhere they'd let me. Street corners, smoky jazz bars, abandoned theaters, even the Paris metro once, for an audience of strangers and passing ghosts. And somewhere along the way, without even trying, I built something of my own. No business cards, no titles. Just me, a piano, and people who listened. My songs started circulating online. Someone posted a clip that went viral, then another. Before long, concert halls called. Record labels emailed. A documentary crew followed me for a year. And the irony? I never changed. I never chased what she wanted me to chase. I just kept playing. That's the part she never understood. Greg may think he's king of the castle, but the truth is, he's standing in a palace I helped inspire. The foundation of Rachel's world was partly built on melodies I wrote in the dark, in a room where she once rested her head on my shoulder. Now she stood beside a man who mocked the very roots of her past, and invited me here, of all places. Why? Was it guilt? Pride? A final test to prove she'd moved on? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. And when I did, when Greg finally discovered who I was, he'd realized that the man he tried to humiliate with words was the one holding the final note. And it was about to play. The orchestra swelled with something orchestral and forgettable, safe, sterile music for people who cared more about appearances than emotion. I'd played in subway tunnels that carried more soul in a single note than this entire ballroom. But I wasn't here to critique the music. I was here to see how far she'd gone, and maybe, just maybe, to remind her what she'd left behind. Matt stayed close by, sipping from his drink like he was watching an exclusive show no one else realized had started. Every once in a while, he glanced at me, half smiling, half anticipating what might come next. He wasn't the only one. Across the ballroom, I caught Rachel's eyes for the first time that evening. For a second, time slowed. Just a beat. She looked exactly as I remembered, flawless, composed, elegant down to her posture. But something behind her eyes flickered. Recognition, hesitation, maybe even regret. She opened her mouth as if to say something. But before she could take a step toward me, Greg was back at her side, clinging to her like a man claiming property. He whispered something in her ear again, and she laughed, thin, mechanical. The kind of laugh you fake when you're performing for a crowd. Greg scanned the room and spotted me again. This time, his smirk had grown wider, cockier, more venomous. And then it happened. He raised his voice, not a little, loud enough to slice through the music, through the crystal clinks of champagne glasses, through polite murmurs of old money conversations. Why is someone like him even here? His voice echoed across the ballroom like a slap in a cathedral. Every head turned. The string quartet stumbled on a note. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the servers paused in their tracks, mid-pour, mid-pass. Greg took a step toward me, drink in hand, arrogance oozing from every pore. "This is an event for people of status," he said, smiling like a man who thought he was delivering the final blow. I set my glass down on the nearby tray, not because I was rattled, but because I wanted both hands free. Not to fight, not to push, just in case I felt like clapping back in the language I knew best. Words, measured and deliberate. I turned to face him, slow and calm. My silence, more powerful than anything I could have said in that moment, made him uneasy. He cocked his head. "What's funny?" he asked, his tone sharper now. I smiled just a little. "Nothing," I said. "Just amused." "By what?" he snapped. "By how fragile your definition of status is," I replied smoothly. "You think it's about money, suits, bank accounts. But it's not. Not really." He scoffed, waving his glass around like a man drunk on his own delusion. "Of course it is. That's exactly what status is. And you? You're nobody. Just a footnote in my wife's past." A collective breath seemed to leave the room. Matt tensed beside me, his hand tightening around his glass. I held Greg's gaze, refusing to blink. "You know," I said, "it's always the ones who scream the loudest about being important, who are actually the most forgettable." Greg's jaw twitched. "I don't know who you think you are," he growled. "No," I said. "You really don't." His eyes narrowed, but the confidence was starting to crack. People were watching now, not just glancing, but watching. Rachel stood frozen beside him, her expression unreadable, except for a slight tension at the corners of her mouth. She knew. Maybe not the whole story, but enough. And Greg? He was playing checkers on a chessboard. I wasn't here to fight for dignity. I brought mine with me. He stepped closer, lowering his voice now, but still dripping with contempt. "Look, man, I don't care what you think you were to her, but she's moved on. She's with a real man now. So do us both a favor. Take your little pity invite and go." It was almost comical. How hard he was trying. How desperately he needed me to disappear. Because deep down, some part of him, some instinct, was telling him he'd made a mistake. But he couldn't name it yet. So I gave him what he wanted. I nodded slowly. "Sure," I said. Greg smirked in victory. Then I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket and unlocked it with a quiet tap. "I'll start by closing my account at your bank." He blinked. "What?" I said. I repeated, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I'll start by closing my $700 million account. That should make things easier for all of us." The room shattered into silence. No more whispers. No more polite laughter. Just stunned, perfect silence. Matt choked on his drink and let out a low whistle. Rachel went pale. Her fingers gripped her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might crack. And Greg? Greg stood there, frozen, mouth slightly open, as if the words couldn't quite register in his brain. "You're joking," he said finally, voice suddenly hollow. I looked at him, dead in the eye. Why would I joke? And just like that, the power shifted. He didn't know who I was. But now, he'd never forget. Greg didn't speak. Couldn't, more like it. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like a blade suspended over his entire illusion of control. His hand, still clutching the crystal glass, trembled just enough to betray the panic swelling behind his polished facade. Across the room, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations had stopped, heads turned. Even the quartet had lost its rhythm. You could hear the faint hiss of champagne fizzing, the distant hum of a wine cooler, but otherwise, silence. The kind that doesn't settle, it suffocates. I kept my posture relaxed, phone still in hand, thumb idly hovering over the screen. Greg blinked. Swallowed. 700 million, he repeated, voice dry, unsteady. Rachel stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. Or worse, a ghost with power. "You heard me," I said, casually slipping the phone back into my pocket. "Your wife's the CEO. I assume she'll manage the fallout." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The room reacted before he did. Gasps, whispers, a few gasps turning into full-blown murmurs. Someone near the back muttered, "No way." Another voice, "Who the hell is he?" Greg's color drained from his face. "That's not. You can't." But I could. And he knew it. Matt, standing beside me with the biggest grin I'd seen all night, whistled low under his breath. "Damn," he muttered. And I thought this would be a boring night. Rachel stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're joking, right?" I tilted my head. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time since I'd walked into that building, I saw the cracks form in her perfect composure. Her hand, tightly curled around the stem of her glass, was shaking, just slightly, but enough. Greg turned to her, panic seeping into his voice. "Rachel, tell me this is a joke." But she said nothing, because she couldn't. She didn't know. She had invited me thinking I was the man she left in that tiny apartment years ago, the man with a keyboard and nothing more than dreams. She never once considered I might have built something without her. Greg stumbled backward, trying to piece it together. He looked at me like I had shifted dimensions, like I'd revealed some cosmic joke he wasn't in on. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came out. It was pitiful. I took a slow breath and turned toward the exit, ready to end the show and let them clean up the emotional debris. Then his hand gripped my arm. "Wait," he said, desperate now. Not arrogant. Not smug. Just desperate. I pulled my arm free, turning to face him one last time. "What?" "You made your point," he stammered. "You're obviously successful. There's no need to humiliate anyone." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough that only he could hear. "No need to what?" I asked. "Remind you that the man you mocked in front of your guests can destroy your image with a single phone call." He swallowed hard. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I could see the rage simmering behind his eyes, the humiliation branding itself into his pride like iron against flesh. I stepped back. "You should be more careful," I said calmly, "who you decide to look down on." Then I walked away. The weight of my words settled into the room like fog. Heavy, lingering, the kind that sticks to your skin and doesn't let go. Behind me, I heard Rachel call after me, but I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew what that tone meant. Too late, too shocked, too unsure of how to fix the mess she'd helped create. I made it halfway through the ballroom when Matt caught up beside me. He exhaled, still riding the adrenaline. "That was legendary." I said nothing, just offered a faint smile. "She had no idea, did she?" he asked. "Not even a clue." "No," I replied. "She never cared to ask." Matt shook his head. "Greg's probably still trying to figure out if this is real life. Man's gonna need therapy." "He'll survive," I said dryly. We reached the entryway, the golden lighting of the lobby washing over us. For a moment, I turned back, not to gloat, but to observe. Rachel stood in the center of the room, the guests now giving her space like she was radioactive. Greg was trying to speak, his voice frantic, gestures wild, like a man clinging to a cliff as the rocks gave way beneath him. No one was laughing anymore. Not at me, anyway. The joke had turned. I nodded to Matt and stepped through the glass doors into the cool night air. The sounds of the city greeted me like old friends. Distant horns, the rumble of engines, the soft shuffle of footsteps on concrete. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. No stage, no audience, just silence. And for once, it sounded like victory. The doors closed behind me with a soft hiss, sealing in the chaos like a lid on a boiling pot. Out here, in the cool night air, I could finally breathe. But the silence didn't last long. Footsteps echoed behind me, hurried, deliberate. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. Her heels always had a particular rhythm. Sharp, controlled, just like her. "Wait," Rachel called, her voice softer now, stripped of its usual steel. I stopped at the top of the steps but didn't turn. She came to a halt beside me, her silhouette bathed in the golden glow of the entry lights. For a moment, neither of us said a word. The tension between us stretched taut. A note held just a second too long. "You didn't have to do that," she finally whispered. I turned to face her, eyebrows raised. "Do what?" "Tell the truth." Her eyes searched mine, as if she was still trying to understand what had just happened. "You embarrassed him." "He embarrassed himself," I replied. "I just let him talk." She looked away, jaw tightening. For the first time tonight, Rachel wasn't the polished executive, the commanding CEO. She was just a woman standing in a gown that suddenly felt too heavy, in a world that no longer made sense. "You could have told me," she said. "Told you what?" I asked. "That I became everything you thought I'd never be?" "No," she said quickly. Then quieter, "that you were okay." I gave a humorless chuckle. "You left. You didn't ask." She winced. Behind us, I could hear the distant thrum of bass from the ballroom, muffled now, like the wedding was still trying to go on without its dignity. A few guests had drifted out onto the balcony above us, their voices hushed, their eyes darting. Watching. Always watching. Rachel folded her arms across her chest, hugging herself. Greg didn't know. He didn't want to know, I cut in. He saw someone who didn't fit into his little narrative and decided that was enough. She swallowed hard, her eyes glinting. "I didn't expect you to come." I raised an eyebrow. "Then why invite me?" She hesitated. "I don't know," she said finally. "Closure, maybe. Or maybe I wanted to see if you'd changed." There it was. The truth wrapped in silk. I took a step closer, not menacing, not emotional, just real. "You didn't leave because I had no ambition, Rachel. You left because I didn't want your ambition. I didn't want the suits, the offices, the life built on quarterly projections and dinner with shareholders." She looked down at her shoes. Expensive, immaculate, unsteady. "I just wanted to live," I said. "To create, to breathe." Silence fell again, thick and weighted. And in that silence, I saw it, flickering in her eyes, the realization, the understanding that everything she had assumed about me had been wrong. That when she walked out of that apartment years ago, she wasn't leaving behind a dreamer with no plan. She was leaving behind a man who didn't need one to become whole. Her voice cracked slightly when she said, "You built something, without me." I nodded. "Yes. And the best part? I never built it for you." Behind her, the doors burst open again. This time, it was Greg, disheveled, flushed. Rage and panic rolled off him in waves as he stormed down the steps. "You're not actually closing your account, right?" he barked, stopping a few feet away from us. "I mean, come on. Let's be reasonable." I looked at him for a long moment, then at Rachel. Her gaze flickered between us like a spectator at a chess match that had already ended. "I said I'd think about it," I replied, tone cool. "And I am." Greg's hands clenched. "You made your point. You don't need to ruin a—" I raised a hand, cutting him off. "Greg," I said, lowering my voice, "I didn't come here to ruin anything. I came because she invited me." I turned back to Rachel. "But now that I've seen this, your world, your choices, I can leave with peace." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Greg took a step forward again. "You smug bastard." Rachel held up her hand. "Enough," she said. Her voice was firm now. Not cold, but weary. Defeated in a way I'd never heard from her. Greg froze. She turned to me. "You've made your point." "I didn't come here to make a point," I said, stepping back. "I came here to end a sentence that's been hanging open for too long." I walked down the last few steps, hands in my pockets, heart finally steady. Behind me, Greg was sputtering something to Rachel. I didn't care to listen. The night had done what it needed to. I hadn't needed a stage. I hadn't needed applause. Just truth. And tonight, that truth had hit harder than anything I could have planned. Let the music play inside. I'd already performed my encore. I reached the bottom of the staircase and paused, letting the cool night air wash over me like a second skin. The heat of the ballroom, the eyes, the tension, it all slid off me out here in the quiet. My hand went to my jacket pocket, fingers brushing against the edges of my phone, but I didn't pull it out. Not yet. The hum of the city pulsed around me. Distant car horns, footsteps on concrete, a saxophone solo somewhere far off, raw, unfiltered, the kind of music that didn't need approval to matter. I was ready to leave this behind. Then I heard her again. Please, don't go. Not like this. I sighed. I didn't turn around immediately. I didn't want to, but I did. Rachel stood at the top of the stairs, framed by the ballroom lights like she belonged on a movie poster, flawless, composed, but no longer unreadable. There was something different now, something broken in her posture, in her eyes. She wasn't the towering executive tonight. She was just a woman who had made a mistake and finally realized it. She descended the stairs slowly, every step more hesitant than the last. We need to talk, she said when she reached me. I nodded once. All right, talk. She paused, eyes flickering over my face like she was searching for a trace of the man she used to know. I was wrong about you, she said, voice low. About everything. I gave a dry chuckle. That's a hell of a wedding toast. She flinched at that, just a little. I thought you'd disappear after I left, that you'd fade. Instead, I said, I became everything you said I couldn't. She nodded slowly. I didn't know. That's the problem, Rachel. You never asked. You never wanted to know. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, gripping the fabric of her dress. You have no idea how many times I thought about calling you, she whispered. Asking if you were okay. If you'd figured it out. If maybe. If I'd finally become someone worth your time? I finished for her. Her eyes widened, guilty. I didn't mean it like that. You did, I said softly, without anger. And it's okay. We were different. We always were. I just didn't want to see it back then. She looked away, biting her lip. There was silence between us again, but it wasn't tense this time. It was reflective, heavy with all the words left unsaid in the years between us. I just wanted to know, she said finally, if you're happy. I looked at her then, really looked. She was beautiful, successful, and tonight, lost. I am, I answered simply. The moment I stopped needing your approval, that's when I found peace. Her face fell, just slightly. Not dramatic, just real. I don't know what she expected from me. Maybe some confession, maybe some apology for the way I'd turned the night upside down. But there was none to give. I had nothing left for her. No bitterness. No love. Just closure. And that was more than enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. Marcus. Where the hell did you disappear to? The text read. You left before the real fun started. I allowed myself a small smile. Of course, he was still watching the aftermath unfold. I typed a quick reply. Figured I'd already played the best part. Let the encore be theirs. Rachel was still watching me. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something else, but nothing came out. You don't need to explain, Rachel, I said, sliding the phone back into my pocket. Not to me. She stepped forward, her voice just above a whisper. You really meant it? About closing your account. I tilted my head. Greg wanted me gone. I'm just making it easier. She exhaled shakily. You know that's going to follow him forever, right? That moment. What you said. I shrugged. Then maybe next time he'll learn not to treat people like dirt. Especially people he doesn't understand. She swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving mine. Do you hate me? I paused at that. No, I said finally. I don't hate you. I just don't need you anymore. There it was the real wound. Not rejection. Not anger. But indifference. She wasn't expecting that. Rachel had spent years climbing, building, controlling everything in her path. But me? I'd slipped through her fingers quietly, without resistance, and still ended up higher than she ever imagined. That was the real twist. I hope, she said, voice trembling, that you find someone who sees you. For real. I already did, I said. And with that, I turned and walked toward the street. I didn't look back. Because I didn't need to. The past was no longer chasing me. And the future? It was finally mine. The city wrapped around me as I walked away from the hotel, glittering, alive, humming with a rhythm only those who truly listen can hear. I didn't call a car. I didn't need to. I wanted to feel the pavement beneath my feet, to move through the night like a man untethered. And for the first time in a long time, I truly was. Behind me, I could still hear the faint echoes of the chaos I'd left behind. The murmurs. The awkward laughter. The gasps that had ricocheted around the ballroom like a gunshot when I said the number 700 million. Let them talk. I'd given them something to remember. A story that would spread through every cocktail circle and boardroom in that ivory tower world Rachel had spent her life climbing. And I hadn't even raised my voice. When I finally got home, the lights of my brownstone glowed like warmth in a world of cold shine. Simple, understated, elegant in the way real things are. No marble floors, no orchestras playing rehearsed melodies. Just me, my music, and the kind of peace money could never buy. Inside, I slipped off my jacket and tossed my keys onto the table. My grand piano sat in the corner of the room, silent but not forgotten. The soft light from the lamp caught its polished surface, and I ran my fingers across the keys like greeting an old friend. Then came the buzz. Marcus, you should have stayed. Richard's losing his mind. It's the most satisfying meltdown I've ever seen. I couldn't help but laugh. I could picture it perfectly, Greg pacing, shouting, trying to salvage his image while Rachel stood motionless beside him, finally realizing the full scope of what she'd lost. Not just in me, in herself. I typed back quickly. I gave them the performance. No need to stick around for the credits. Seconds later. You broke the internet. The wedding's trending. Everyone's sharing clips. Even the champagne toast got overshadowed. I rolled my eyes. Of course it had. The world loved irony almost as much as it loved spectacle. But I hadn't done it for show. That was the thing they would never understand. I didn't need a crowd. I just needed the truth to stand in the room long enough to be seen. Another message popped up. Someone recorded the moment you said $700 million. Already viral. Captioned, "The art of a silent flex." I nearly choked on my drink. I shook my head, still smiling, and made my way over to the piano. I sat down slowly, let my fingers hover over the keys, then began to play softly, gently, a melody that had once been Rachel's favorite. Not for her. Not anymore. But for me. For the memory. For closure. Halfway through the piece, another message lit up my screen. A video. Marcus again. Curious, I tapped play. The scene was from just after I'd left the ballroom. Someone had filmed Greg having a full-blown breakdown in front of a small crowd of startled guests. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, was now wild and unhinged. "What the hell were you thinking, inviting him here?" he shouted at Rachel. "Do you know how many people are laughing at us right now?" Rachel didn't respond. She looked exhausted, her eyes dark with something far deeper than shame. Regret, maybe. Or defeat. A voice off camera, Marcus, naturally, chimed in. "Oh, don't take it so personally, Greg. You're just mad you found out the hard way that you're not the most important man in your wife's life tonight." The gasp from the surrounding guests was pure gold. Greg turned red, fists clenched, fury pouring off him like sweat. He tried to lunge at Marcus, only for someone to hold him back. "You think this is funny?" he shouted. "No," Marcus replied coolly. "But it is poetic." The video ended there. I laughed. Not out of spite, but because of the absurdity of it all. The same man who had tried to humiliate me had ended the night as a walking meme. And I hadn't had to lift a finger. I texted Marcus back. "That video made my whole night." He replied instantly. "Glad you liked it." Greg didn't even go home with her. Stormed off alone. But he's Googling piano lessons now. I smirked and set the phone down, turning my attention back to the piano. I didn't need vengeance. I didn't need the world to know my name. But it had found me anyway. And Rachel? She would return to her glass tower, put on her power suit, and keep pretending. But deep down, she'd always remember this night, not because of who she married, but because of the man she let go. I pressed the final chord and let it ring out into the quiet. No cameras. No audience. Just the truth echoing in the walls. That was enough. Because some performances aren't meant for applause. They're meant for peace. And tonight, I had finally earned mine. As the final note faded into silence, I leaned back from the piano and closed my eyes. And in that stillness, it all made sense. The lessons, the weight, the clarity that only time can bring. People spend their lives chasing validation, titles, money, status, believing that success is measured by applause. But the truth? Real value is quiet. It's built in solitude, in resilience, in staying true to who you are when the world tells you to change. Rachel left me because I didn't fit her definition of ambition. And for a while, I believed her. I questioned my path, my worth. But life taught me this. You don't need to be understood to be right. You just need to keep going. To those older than me, those who've lived long enough to feel the sting of being underestimated or left behind, know this. Your story isn't over because someone turned the page without you. The people who truly matter will see you not for what you appear to be, but for what you've quietly become. And when the world finally looks your way, let them see the strength that never needed an audience. That, I've learned, is the purest kind of power.